Metcalf first walked into this building and joined the Anthropology faculty in UVA in 1976, almost 38 years ago.
I was the only one who heard all three.
This is about Peter.
I can tell you
This is about Peter. Over the years, he's taught us many things about the poetry of ritual life and prayer, about the shapes of death and their celebration, about Bornean rivers and the longhouse communities along them, about the ravishing of the great Bornean hardwood forests, about anthropological fieldwork, and about the truths we seek and the lies we tell, and so much more. He has regaled us with many a fantastic tale, told as only Peter can tell tales. And perhaps,
some of it based on truth.
and perhaps unwittingly,
Just for speaking.
he has given us lessons every day in the liveliness of the English language. Most of all, he has filled Brooks Hall with great fun and his exuberant laugh.
And plants.
And we will always hear Peter's laugh echo through Brooks Hall and smile. Today we celebrate the fullness of Peter's many years with us. First with this lecture, which we're all looking forward to. And then immediately following, there will be a reception downstairs in the Commons. And that will commence the ritual part of the afternoon. And Fred Damon will be the master of ceremonies. So I hope you all will join us downstairs afterwards to celebrate in the celebration of Peter that we all enjoy. Thank you all.
Not quite yet. Welcome. Dear friends, colleagues, guests. Today's occasion is joyous and bittersweet. And so you'll have to forgive me if I betray in this introduction more emotion than is typical. I'll begin the way we started in December by thanking the faculty again, giving us the responsibility to put these talks together. All of us, Arsalan Khan, Julie Starr, Jack Stetzel, Rose Wellman, and I have given our best to bring you a slate of accomplished scholars doing interesting things. We have not taken this venture lightly. We've also had a lot of fun, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. All right. As much as these events are crucibles of knowledge, they are rituals, and we, the faithful, it is fitting and proper then that we should end this series this year with the wisdom of one of our own dearest elders, and someone no less as familiar with the significance and transformative power of ritual as anyone we know. Peter Metcalf does not need this introduction, but we do, because if there's any hope for this discipline to make sense of the world, to make a difference in the world, if there's to be hope for our projects, great and small, we should recognize and honor the genius that lives among us and the gift it is to have dwelled. Usually on such occasions we celebrate the many achievements of our guests. There's so much I could say about Professor Metcalf and his career. He holds a PhD from Harvard University. He has worked at the universities of Singapore and Papua New Guinea. And for many years he has warmed the hearts of his students and fellow faculty at UVA with his charming voice. Peter has published 6 books, from A Borneo Journey into Death in 1982 to his 2009 work, The Life of the Longhouse, a deft integration of oral and written histories, illustrating how even the remotest of societies produce subtle ethnic patterns at the far reaches of a modern trading complex. You should not forget his primer in anthropology, distinguished both for its clarity and its incisiveness. If you don't use this in your intro classes, heck, if you haven't read it and you want to remind yourself where we came from and what we're up to, you should. But my personal favorite is They Lie, We Lie, which is Pete's nuanced response to the nihilistic tendencies of postmodern gibberish. An urgent dispatch on getting on with the business of ethnography, as well as a stirring account of his peculiar relation with a cunning old widow. All of this wrapped into a lyrical memoir about a community that no longer exists as he wants to. Peter Metcalf is a consummate ethnographer. He has confided in us, induced at times with the aid of distilled spirits taken in close company, that in the first 6 months of his fieldwork, he cried every night. Yet, by the third year in the longhouse he longed to rue, he found it hard to imagine coming home. And that, he says, is why he knew he had to. His work recalls for us, if anything, the value of sustained engagement with a particular place, a particular people, of exploring worlds that present us with a radical alternative to our own, often alienated and suffocated efforts to create meaning from a universe in disjunction. And he has shown us, with open eyes and gutsy conscience, what happens when these worlds collide, when entire worlds of experience are felled and trampled underfoot, and yet, in their own way, carry on, if need be, with Hulk Hogan and Randy Flores. Peter Metcalf is a consummate teacher. He has carried the torch of our intellectual ancestors and the historical memory of our discipline and passed these on to those of us who have had the fortune of huddling around the table in his corner office on the 3rd floor, waiting anxiously for his little bell to ring in salute to some meager flash of insight. He has even taught some of us how to sail. And with his brilliant and lovable cackle, he has taught us all how to laugh in spite of our failures and flops. Peter Metcalf is a consummate friend, never too aloof to offer his ear and a word of encouragement, never too sophisticated to accept a simple dinner, never too romantic to help whet the Machiavellian edge in our grant applications. Can't get to the field without the money. And how many of us share fond memories of gathering with our faces lit by some dim lamp like the Barawan around their storytellers, so that Peter might transport us impossibly to a wide veranda in Upriver Point. Malut de, malut kita, they line, we line. This is how, Professor Metcalf tells us, the Barawan experts began their tales of the near and distant past, of their bygone relatives and their heroes who carved out river valleys and climbed to the stars. Does Peter mean to tell us to his line? Is he playing with us? Will he be playing with us today? I, for one, certainly hope so. Because he reminds us at the end that culture is simply and profoundly the fiction by which we live, the fiction we all bear the responsibility to rewrite. The fiction that makes living, living. Thank you, Pete, for making the stories of our life a little brighter, a little more real. I know you would have preferred to have done this in an olive grove, but I thank you nonetheless for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you. Can I sign you up to do my eulogy? I'll say those comments because you do my eulogy, right? Probably don't.
Oh, God, not yet.
Really, I couldn't possibly keep up with you. And thank you all for coming. I'm quite blown away by people turning up here that I hadn't seen in a whole long time. I'm honoured by your presence. Thank you very much. I'm afraid Roberto has pinched my punchline, which is Maluk de Malukita. And he told you we didn't set it up this way. I promise you, did we? No. And he mentioned to you this little old lady I used to know when I was doing field work, who was sort of my Matrona in some ways, but not so easy with Matrona. I mean, difficult person. And she stood about this high on me, and she was straight as a rail, and she had a lot of presence. I mean, nobody ever messed with Cassie, right? She was the boss pretty much over there. And she used to tell these stories, and the stories were mainly about ancestors, of course. And she would always begin with that phrase, "Malum de maluketa," which was to draw everybody's attention. She'd give everybody a drink, and then when everybody sat down, she'd say the phrase, right? And what it means literally is they lie, we lie. And you know, that's a funny phrase to use right at the beginning of telling everybody these stories, right? But it's not too surprising. The Brahma are tremendous liars. They tell you complete lies just to tease you, right? And then when they finish, they look at you deadpan and say, "Did you believe that?" It's a very hard question to answer because you never know when you're going to say something offensive. So they're always doing that, and they talk all the time. That's what long hours is about. Everybody talks morning, noon, and night. And people talk in the attic when you're asleep, which gives you the impression that the ancestors are up there floating. The voices come down. In point of fact, what Cassie meant was exactly the reverse of its lies. What she was actually saying was, you sit here now and hear my story. She's particularly talking to the little kids, right? And she says, and I sat where you used to sit now, and I listened to my grandmother, and she in turn listened to her grandmother, right? So what she's saying is, if they told me lies, then I'll repeat them to you, right? Which is a very nice sort of balance of skepticism and empowerment, right? And of course what she was doing was saying she was the voice of the ancestors. That's all. Well, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to say let me point out that I am Evans Pritchard's grandson, and also his great-grandson, because I had two padrones in life. One of them was the student of Evans Pritchard, so that makes me grandson, right? And the other was the student of Rodney Needham, which makes me, David Maybury Lewis, Rodney Needham, DP. So there you go. I mean, I got street creds, right? One of the things I did as a result of all that is that in some peculiar and strange way, I stuck with the business that they did. I stuck to the ancestors, and I did the thing that I'm going to call today the Great Project, and I'll try and tell you a little bit about that. I didn't start out with this business of doing this. When I started out in New Zealand, there were no research grants in New Zealand. New Zealand doesn't have research grants. It's a peanut-sized little country. And the standard thing you did was get a job as a school teacher out in the islands. That meant Polynesia, right? And your school teachers get enough to live on, and then they have an entree into all the communities. Everybody likes a school teacher. So it was a good way of being and doing field work. And I would have done it the same way, except I got posted somewhere different, which was to the University of Papua New Guinea, where I taught the first year that the University of Papua New Guinea existed, right? So I get posted up there. I was a school teacher, but you know, the context was a bit different. And the place was amazing. It was a total zoo. And the students actually lived in tents, bloody great tents, out in the tropics, you know, mud everywhere and so on. And the interesting thing about it was that the kids were incredibly dead keen. They were the first kids ever to go to university in New Guinea. And they go, we're crossing a big margin here, this is something very important. So they're all very keen, knowing that something good was happening. And from my point of view, that represented the internationalism of my generation, around the time of that time. And it was an internationalism that was very buoyant, because we knew the British Empire was gone. I mean, all the empires were gone. Actually, Papua New Guinea was still a territory when I went there, so effectively it was a colony, with all that entails. So I saw the last thing. I think I was in the last colony ever. Right, yeah. And so we all knew that was going away, and we also knew that the world was progressive, right? After all, the British had totally reformed their society. We destroyed all the aristocrats by taxing the living daylights out of them. Let me point out to you, that works. So my proposition was that internationalism, you know, was very embracing, and it was really true. Everybody felt that way about it. And when I was in Port Moresby, I did some research there. It was MA research, and I worked with immigrants into the town. And there were immigrants everywhere. And if you walked around in downtown Port Moresby, you didn't see them because all the shanties were hidden behind the hills. Because if they built them inside of the village, they come and bulldoze them down, right? So everybody would move into the valleys out of sight. So this is huge population of, what's shanty town dwellers all around the place, which most people didn't even know was there. So I started travelling around interviewing people there, and I would roll up on this little tiny old motorcycle with the guy sitting on the back who was polylinguistic. I mean, he was quite amazing, and I needed him, because he had to make connections. And whenever we went somewhere, it was, I talk English to you, you talk whatever it is you're talking to him, he talks whatever it is to him, and so on and so on and so on. What we were doing was looking for a train of one talks, right? Which took me a time. But every time I showed up in the slums, everybody thought I was a cop. They go, white man, police. And go, what, I'm a tiny little Scrooge, but they were all disappeared. Chow! It was all very impressive. And then the first summer that I was a grad student in Boston, I managed to pull in some money. I had to have money to get through the summer because I didn't have any other income otherwise. So I got myself on a research project, and it was in Trinidad, right? And that was great fun too. And what did I do in Trinidad? I went and worked with the people in what was called Happy Valley, which of course was a shanty town. And at that stage I thought, I was going to become a slumologist. That's what it was heading, and I liked that idea. Right? Then I arrived in Cambridge in 1968, which was when it was all happening. And the place bloody amazed me. I mean, I'm just a quiet country boy from New Zealand, and what I found in Boston was bloody amazing. And everything was crazy. And there were every weekend there were free concerts on Cambridge Common, right, with rock bands. Wherever you stood, there was this wonderful scent of brass. It's what I associate with Harvard. Very nice. And also there was a bunch of stuff going on at the time, which kept everybody very active in what you might call politics. So there was a lot of agitation going on about that.
Yeah.
So when I was at Harvard, I basically learned nothing about anthropology, but I went to a hell of a lot of rallies. In the end, more educational. I wound up staying in a house where we had SDS in the basement, Students for a Democratic Society. I'm sure that means nothing to the vast majority of them. Never mind. There was also, we had people living in that house who became weathermen. Weathermen. And what they did was they were Harvard undergraduates, and they decided that in order to be real communists, in order to be real lefties, they should go and learn from the workers, up to the workers of Vanguard class, right? So they all got jobs in factories and hung around drinking beer and watching football and all the rest of it, and then disappeared. They wanted to join the working class, and they did. Some of them were wanted. I mean, they committed crimes and all the rest of it, and then they disappeared underground. What I have to say about all this is quite simple. What it is, which is all of that stuff that we did, all of those things we focused on, everything failed. And we all know why. I mean, that world that we thought was going to appear never did. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the cruelest thing that I ever went through. We really thought the world was going to get better because there were all those kids there, and we were all going to make it better. And I thought that this was really going to change the world. And I remember when I arrived at Harvard, everybody was making speeches. People would quite literally get a chair, put it down the middle of Harvard Yard, and start making a speech. There were Lenins on every corner. Very entertaining. But that stuff evaporated, right? I went off to wild and woolly corners of the world. When I came back, no political activism, all gone, right? And I said, where is everybody? And they said, well, the women have all gone to law school, and the men are in communes in upstate New York. So that all disappeared. I mean, we're still regretting it. What are we supposed to do now? Really? I mean, we've got David flag who wants us to do anarchism, and I hope that works. The rest of it is really gloomy. Just read the newspaper. Nothing is happening out there that's anything but bloody horrible. And we didn't expect that. And of course, in the end, we got our internationalism. Internationalism did win. But unfortunately, it wasn't our internationalism. Our internationalism was going to be the internationalism of the international, right? But what we got instead was global liberal economy. Right? We got the economy that's out there right now. And that effectively turns out to be the rule of the oligarchs, the world oligarchs. And the reason why they're taxing out of existence the way the British did is not so easy, because they've just disappeared from another country. So until the whole world gets organised, corner all the bloody oligarchs and tax them, we have an enemy we can't struggle with. Everybody I know that was of that generation was involved in those things, they've all become Buddhists. Very obvious reasons. If you turn inwards, you might be able to fix your own little world. The world out there, forget about it. Okay, when I arrived in Harvard, I went into a program that's called SOCREL, Social Relations. Right? And that was a completely weird department. It was unique to Harvard. Harvard thought that everybody was going to follow it, and it was going to catch on, right? And it's founded, in the late 50s, was it? And it was very trendy when it was started. And it all revolved around a master paradigm that was put together by Talcott Parsons, or TP, if you probably knew it. And I'm sure you all know this, but he had this grand paradigm for the whole social sciences, and it was chopped up in little squares, and we got a box in the bottom left-hand corner, and our box was called culture. Nice, we got culture. None of the others did, I might point out. What's the other? Sorry? No. And I was going from social anthropology, and you go, well, what am I supposed to do? Evidently I can float around in all the other boxes. TP was, of course, the guy who geniused the place, and when I was there, he would wander around in the corridors, and everybody thought he was a janitor. He was totally scruffy. He always had his shirt pulled down the back of his trousers, so a total mess. And then he came and gave us lectures. My intro lectures in grad school were given by Talcott Parsons, right? And he was incredibly boring. You could barely hear him. He was invisible. Less than what's Rich Handler said to me that it was time for TP to have a revival. It was time someone got in there and revived TP. And I said to him, right, I'm retiring. Not doing that again. And of course, he also trained Clifford Geertz, right? And have you ever heard Clifford Geertz speak? The speaker's little man can't hear a word he says. I mean, he got it from TV. Just and I'm going to make this boast, since I'm claiming ancestral connections, that I once played charades with Clifford Geertz. The first Thanksgiving I was here, because the first friend I made at Harvard was dating the daughter of the guy who ran the place, who was an economist, right? So I got invited up to, Princeton and all the rest of it, and they had people over for dinner, and including Clifford Geertz, and we played charades afterwards, right? The great man symbols, right? Clifford Geertz. I have never in my life seen anybody who was so incompetent. And his wife would be there. His wife, wives and husbands, they communicate right. None of that. And she said, I could never get any message through to him. And it was the economist who brought, it was that economist, whose name I'm going to forget, who brought social sciences to the Institute of Advanced Studies, right? And all of the other, and the physicists and all the rest were totally disgusted. I mean, they had Einstein to begin with, and then they got Geertz. Okay, so I was going to segue. I was going to, since Sockwell had all these different things in it, I go in the anthropology thing and I just slide sideways and get into the sociology program, right? Very easy to do. In fact, that's what I've said there, right? So I sat around and looked at Harvard sociology, and guess what? I became totally disillusioned. You know, I didn't mind studying statistics because I used to actually teach statistics at the University of Singapore, so I could do that stuff. But you know, all they did was number crunch and count things and all the rest of it. And they were all machine men. They worked for the government. That was back in the days of LBJ and all these social programs going on. And they just plugged in and milked more and more money out of it. And then they did bigger and bigger surveys and all this, and then they crunched those. We all know what the story is. You know, you stood there and you looked at sociology in those days and you go, no, that wasn't what I'm interested in at all. You know? It's not, there was no humanist sociology knocking around. And in particular, there was a guy named let's see, what was his name? Alex Inkeley, right, who I'm sure none of you have ever heard of. He was the key man in sociology back in those days. And he wanted out of Sockwell because when he put in grant applications, people would say, Sockwell, what's that? So he wanted the whole thing broken up, and he succeeded in doing that. And until very recently, I used to have a button that said, Sockwell lives. Sockwell was a lot of fun because you learned, you know, everything was on the table. Very strange things. Anyway, so at that stage in the game, I decided to do a 180. So I went off and joined the Sound Project, which belonged to Herb de Boer, right? And the general proposition was to go over to the Kalahari Desert, work with the Sound and so on. And it was very romantic, hunters and gatherers. And what everybody said at the time was hunters and gatherers is where it's at. Right? Because they're like the real people, right? You've got to get back here to find the old hunters and gatherers. And it was sort of a social movement. And there were people who hung around in Harvard Square and they could feed themselves by going into restaurants and cleaning up the plates before the service staff got there. And they called that hunting and gathering. What it meant is, I'm not going to drag the world down, I'm just going to eat what's spare, right? Which I thought was quite reasonable. And then, of course, you know how that went. The Herb de Boer movement. Herb de Boer was colleagues with a guy named Bob Trivers, who I'll mention again in a minute. And they were moving, you know, in all kinds of exciting new directions with evolution and all that sort of thing. And we all know where that was headed. It was headed into sort of, you know, contemporary. Actually, it was sort of the beginning of sociobiology. It all started around there. And I was a TA for Herb de Boer. One of the things I noticed was in his slide presentation, he'd come in and hand me a box of slides, and I'd show the slides, and he'd talk about them, right? And what he had pictures of gorillas and San people, and then monkeys and San people, the whole thing, and you know, I'm sitting there, it's got funny vibes about it. So anyway, I decided to go on my own, and which meant, you know, find somewhere else in the world you want to go. And, you know, I did that. And I wrote grant applications and managed to do it. But let me point out that nobody at Harvard ever gave me the slightest bit of advice or read any of my grant applications. Nothing. That was Harvard. They said, we admitted you, so you're a gentleman, but don't bother us anymore. You've done it. So I decided that I had to go somewhere else, and I remembered when I'd been hippieing around in Southeast Asia, I'd gone up the Barang, which is the big river at the northwest corner of Borneo, and I got a little way up on public transport, and then there was a little bit of a hill over the top of the hill, and I looked up the river, and the river is big, muddy, you know, great grey green Limpopo River going into the interior, like this, towards the mountains. And I said to myself, I'll go up there one day. And that's what I did. I mean, it was about that elaborate. I my grant application. Yeah. The whole thing was pure romanticism. And what I have to say is there's nothing wrong with pure romanticism. You know, the motivation doesn't matter. What you do is something else, right? You've got to get sober-sided about that, but the motivation is perfectly right. And in particular, what I was thinking of was Raymond Firth in Tilapia, right? And the person who got me into anthropology in the first place was the cover picture. There was a picture on the frontispiece, right? And you open it up, and there's this guy in there, and he's Pa Whangarere, who is the heir to the title of Kafika. And he's sitting there, you know, first showed up with a camera, so he just sat down where he was, right? And he had his digging sticks, he was in his garden, right? And of course, he turns out to be a guy with tremendous shoulders going down to a very narrow waist, right? And he's wearing a breech clout, and he has long hair, as Chickapeans did, and he has cordyline what's it called, a crown on his head, right? And he looks at the camera like this. It's not a snotty English one. And what the picture says to you very plainly is, I know who I am. Do you know who you are? So I decided I had to fly a panga lady, and lo and behold, I did. But she turned out to be small and female. She was Cassie. And I also found an island, but it happened to be in the jungle, not in the middle of the sea. But it came to the same thing. The community was very enclosed at that point in time. Cassie was a difficult informant. She was often obstructive, and she would say to people in the longhouse, don't tell him about the following things. I don't want him knowing about those things. That's a funny informant. But nevertheless, I was always referred to her when there was something important going on, and I had to collect story from her, so that's why I wound up sitting there, not with my technical run. I would sit there making notes, and she would say, Maluk de Malukita, and off she would go. And I would do my best to follow and write a few notes and so on. And Cassie knew that I at the time, I really didn't catch on to this. Cassie knew that her little world was going to disappear. She knew that. And what was going to, she knew that was going to happen because Christianity was pushing in all around, and there was basically nowhere, the kids were getting drawn into a cash economy bit by bit, and she knew that her little world was going to disappear. It was going to be destroyed by cash and Christianity. And so it was going to go. What did it was logging. And when I was there, I didn't know how fast the logging business would speed up. In the middle of the 1970s, there was some logging going on, but not very much. By the middle of the 1980s, huge amounts of capital had been pumped in, which meant massive earth moving here, and then trucks that could pick up huge rainforest trees and dump them, and they'd truck them out. It was amazing. And that one was in the mid-80s. Huge profits were made. They were all shipped offshore, needless to say. I mean, the local people who ran those things all got apartments in the West End of London, etc. And the big villain of the piece was Rimbanani Joe. Rimbanani Joe is now logging the entire Pacific, particularly New Guinea. And the whole thing is owned by a guy named Chong Tosyong, who is one of those oligarchs. Right? I'm going to catch him. Okay, I saw that happen. I watched it happen. By the mid-90s, it was over. Let's say the rainforest had effectively been destroyed. And upriver life was, everybody lived in tar-paper shacks down on the coast by the time I got back in the mid-90s. So I literally saw a world disappear, just evaporated. And when I came back to Harvard, I was telling people about this. I was embittered against it. And I got laughed at by George Marcus, who was in grad school at that time. He was there as well. And what he said was, look, he's playing straight into the stereotype of anthropologists. They sit around going, the world was better. The primitive should go back to being primitive. He liked it that way, right? He was terribly sort of condescending to take this view, right? And of course, I always used to play straight into George Marcus's hand. Every time he came up with me on this stereotype, I would say, yes! That's right. And I became one of his stock characters. I represented archaic anthropology. Right? Anthropology of something that was obviously on its way out. I represented, the last of the old dinosaurs, which is exactly what I claim. Okay. The other thing is, I would say very plainly that the people after the logging business were infinitely worse off. Their way of life was infinitely worse than it had been when they lived in longhouse communities. And I can substantiate that with lots of details. I'm talking about the fact they could feed themselves, which they now can't do. They live in shanty towns and so on. And once again, I played in his hand, and he laughed. And I might tell you, I'm being catty at the present moment, that when we were talking about this, George Marcus said he was never going to do field work anywhere where he couldn't get a decent breakfast in a hotel when he needed to. Not part of the tradition. Also, I say, without slaves blinking an eyelid, I would say I was appointed by the Brahmin. Because you're self-appointed, right? But when I left Long True, I tried to explain to people what I did. They all thought, first of all, they thought I was a communist agent. And they thought I was a missionary. And then I absolutely denied that. So they said, it must be a communist insurgent. Because there was a communist insurgency going on around at the time. And eventually concluded that I wasn't that. And then when I left, they said, your job is to go out into the world and make our name big. So I am the Rowan, public relations man. They appointed me. Also, I'm quite happy about saying, that Clifford says, our great claim to validation is you say I, but I was there, right? And what I say is, I was there. What I say to that. And if you'd said that to EP, he would have said, that's what I mean by doing research. I was there. Okay, punchline is I was witness to a world in the mid-70s that is now gone, and I had no idea it was going to go so fast. And my way of taking that was that a huge obligation had been put on my shoulders, because the only person who's ever going to describe this, when I went to Barron, one of the reasons why I picked Barron District was the only one anthropologist had ever been there before, and he was mad as a two-year-old. So, I had a huge piece of real estate all to myself. I thought I was going. But by the same token, I'm the only one who knows anything about it. So I said, I'm going to write ethnographies. I mean, even back in the 70s and 80s, writing ethnography was going out of fashion. For one thing, you couldn't sell the bloody things. No one would publish them. Because, who's going to read them? What people are going to read is George bloody Marcus, right? and I'm now told that these books don't sell. They go straight to the trash heap, nobody bothers. Old sociological theories dead on the market, no need for that. So I decided I was going to do it that way. So I joined this thing that I call the Great Project. I mentioned EP, but I know perfectly well this wasn't an exclusively British thing. There was an American way of arm training into that. The descendants of Schneider and so on, including some of my colleagues right here. When Cassie used to talk about the ancestors, she used to say, my children are going Christian, but I'm not going to the Christian land of the dead. I'm going with the ancestors. That's what she said, I'm going with the ancestors, was her phrase, right? It's a little bit creepy doing that, because if I wound up with the ancestors, I'm going to be kicking around with some really weird, eccentric people, right, of that generation. They were weird to look at. Imagine being an afterlife in Ed Winter. Almost nobody here remembers Ed Winter, but and they were all drunks, right? I mean, okay, that project that I'm talking about, that I'm calling the Great Project, was always in a hurry. The Great Project, as far as I'm concerned, begins somewhere in the 1910s or 1920s. I mean, I'm talking, Malinowski and people of that generation, right? And American equivalents thereof. And when it started, everybody knew that we were in a hurry. Everybody knew that modernization had already harvested a lot of people, right? And there was no point going back to the field work anymore. So we had to find the ones that were still somewhat defended against this. And so that's how it was, that we wound up tracing into jungles and forests and all the rest of it. Anthropology doesn't do that anymore, and there's good reasons why it doesn't do it anymore. But at that time, the project did mean running off into jungles and deserts and all the rest of it. And you were supposed to catch horrible diseases. I told Harry Sickler off once because he never got malaria. I said to him, "You're not getting to club." Hookworm is good. Hepatitis. The other thing to mention about that is that the whole epoch was lived under the shadow of the Golden Bough. And nowadays, we don't read the Golden Bough. One time I taught a course in comparative religion for graduate students, and I said, let's all speed read the Golden Bough. I got it through it, skimming furiously in 17 hours. best-selling book ever in the anthropology business. And somewhere I read that the only thing that outsells it is the Bible. And if you go into any junky second-hand bookstore, you will find the Golden Bough. And the Golden Bough, the full edition of the Golden Bough, came out it was finished about 1917, and that edition had 12 volumes and an extra one for bibliography. And I happen to own a copy of that edition, which was given to me by David and Betty. I keep it as a trophy. I promise not to sell it. So, you know, the thing about the Golden Bough is that all educated people knew about the Golden Bough. You know, I'm trying to remember the name of the great critic. Oh boy, I never forget his name. Sorry? No. Eliot was totally into the Golden Bough.
Yes, he was.
But there was a critic I'm thinking of, who was the greatest critic of his generation. Lionel Trilling.
Yeah.
We got it.
Look at that name.
I'm the one who got it. And Lionel Trilling says no book in modern times has had more impact on poetry and literature than the Golden Bough. That's pretty heavy. But also it had a common readership. You know, people would sit around at dinner tables, argue about the stuff that Fraser was telling everybody. It was all racy, you know, there was sacrificing virgins and all this sort of thing. Very good stuff for Victorian dinner table conversation. And you know, so when we came along, guess what? We weren't conspicuous by comparison with the Golden Bough, and we still aren't. Right? And there are several reasons for these, but one of the reasons is when the great project began, our literary genre was the ethnography, right? Now, an ethnography doesn't have to be fascinating. It doesn't have to be readable. And for the most part, bloody well isn't. We used to teach courses with Anthropology 703 when we would read 12 ethnographies, and we would say which one was most readable and so on and so on. But you know, why should they be readable? You know, dissertations in mathematics aren't readable, or anything like that. Why should they be readable? They're supposed to be specialist documents. But everybody had this notion that they had to be literature at the same time as well, and we keep on struggling with all that. And you know, so what happens is, instead of us, the Golden Bough, a new version of Golden Bough, what happened was that ethnographies of piled up in libraries, and field notes of old defunct ethnographers, you know, accumulated in tin boxes all over the place and so on. That was what was produced by what I call here the great project, 20th century anthropology. That was the product, and it's very dispersed, and it was collected by a bunch of eccentrics. I mean, you've got to be pretty weird to have done this game in the first place, and you know, when you went there, you had bad health problems and you came back. It's amazing how many people did field work and never wrote it up. No ethnography at all. So you know, they took grant money but didn't deliver. And that's what the archive is that was accumulated during the 20th century. Meanwhile, we came up with our own definition of primitive, and the primitives were the people with some degree of freedom of thought of action, freedom of thought and action outside the old world empires and civilizations, right? It means, and what that means is they lived independently in some real way, right? By definition, they included the Americas, North Americas, Oceania, Australia, by definition, and also large chunks of Africa and Asia and so on. It was a big piece of real estate. And when everybody went off to find those little corners, it's not surprising they got a bit dispersed. After all, you know, Fraser just sits in his office in Oxford. Okay. Now, in the 21st century, I point out the obvious, the notion of primitive man is gone. I mean, none of us would, I don't think any of us would actually say the word primitive without choking a tonsil before we say it. And, you know, we know why he's gone, right? The word is condescending, it's very confusing, it means all kinds of things at the same time. It means archaic, it means crude, and it means irrational. The word primitive means all those three things. So, you know, if you say something is primitive, you've got to be pretty careful what you're talking about in that. So we dropped the word. So, well, of course, primitive man has disappeared. because there isn't any corner of the world which isn't totally absorbed in the global economy, right? So that the great project ran out of steam, and it sort of slid into the background as it absolutely had to, because the opportunities for it were decreasing to the point of vanishing, right? So anthropology had to reinvent itself in the 21st century, and that's what's going on around me at the present moment. And it'll be interesting to see what anthropology turns out to be in the 21st century. It's a bit early to tell, but it certainly won't be the great project. It was something totally different. And whether the discipline of anthropology will survive, I do not know. I mean, it doesn't have to. The garment of knowledge has no seams. I mean, anthropology just get our focus, and we get sociology over here, and I don't know, media studies over there, and cultural studies, and journalism. I don't know what's coming. So use judges better figure out. It's on the shoulders of the graduate students and our junior faculty to figure out what that's going to be. Right? And I think the only continuity we have with the original anthropology was that we still talk about what I like to call ethnographic niches. What that means is you have a place where you can hang out and you don't interview people. Instead, you join in their conversations. Their conversations are open-ended, and you join in, and sometimes they talk amongst themselves, you can't follow what they're talking about. So you do this open-ended sort of conversation thing all the time. And I'm watching the clock. I had a long introduction. I've got another 15 minutes to go. Okay, so it occurs to me that one thing I hope people stick to is that notion of doing unstructured research, right? And unstructured research drives other social scientists. People using that word anymore. We don't say social. Anyway, all those people think that we have no methodology, and we were a very slack bunch of people. And you go, yes, that's it. When we begin open-ended ethnography, we're going to pay attention to what they tell us. We're not going to phrase questions, right? And we take it for granted that what we will find is something we hadn't even imagined was there. I mean, the great genius of anthropological fieldwork is we look for things we don't know what we're looking for. We go fishing, and we can't get this idea across the sociologists we get. Meanwhile, of course, while all that's going on, primitive man has come back. In the 21st century, there's a new primitive man back. And we all know what that is. It's the contemporary fashion for genetic determinism, right? Which is all over the bloody TV and all over magazines and everywhere. And I quote now Trivers. I mentioned Trivers in connection with Irving before. Trivers once said in an interview, I think to the New Yorker, he said that within 10 years, psychology, sociology, and anthropology will simply be branches of sociobiology. Them spiked words. Did we fight back adequately? Meanwhile, there's a paper like Dawkins, it's neo-atheist ground, right? And I have been reading that the last few years, and I don't dislike all the things, the bad things that Dawkins says about world religion at the present moment. I totally agree with. But then he does something strange. He goes off on a little tack, which is go somewhere else entirely. And this is also taken up with other people. There's a guy named Nicholas Wade who wrote Religion is in Your Genes. Right? What to say? Okay. The underlying argument of this is always the same. I mean, you read it through and it's said in different ways, it comes out in different ways and all the rest of it. But it always comes out the same way. And this is the way Irv de Voort did it way back in the 70s. Is what they said is human beings didn't evolve in urban society. They evolved out there on the savannah in Africa. Right? Everybody's running around over there doing hunting and gathering in small bands and things like that. And that's what we were evolved to do. You shove us into big cities and all the rest of it, everything goes nuts, right? We have crime on the streets and all the rest of it. And we're not supposed to be doing this, And in the middle of all that, they say they come up with a theory of religion. Religion, guess what? It was useful in prehistoric times because it helped people in groups to interact with one another, right? And act collectively and so on, right? It's the famous old glue theory of religion, right? It's a religion sticks people together. Now, that's doesn't match up with everything we know. This is the kind of argument that I call vulgar Durkheim. Not only do they do that, but they also produce a kind of logic that was very conspicuous in 19th century anthropology. And the logic is, we know it was that way because it must have been that In the 19th century, people sat down and said, we're hearing around all these different ways of doing things, and we're going to sit in Oxford and figure out the order in which they happen, right? You're going to figure out the evolution of the human mind, right? And matrilineal must have come before patrilineal, actually matriarchy before patriarchy. And the logical reason for this was that every child knows who its mother is, but not necessarily who its father is, right? Ergo, matrilineality must have been invented first, right? Does that check out with the facts? Not exactly. That's not the way it works. Also, they invented wonderful things like group marriage, right, in the 19th century. This was when everybody said, let's all get together and have children. Nobody ever found that anywhere. All that stuff got invented in the 19th century. And if you asked why it was that way, they said, well, look at the end product. The end product means it must have been that way. Right? And that's exactly what evolutionary psychology says. They kind of have no evidence about the creature called primitive religion, no evidence at all about that, right? They just assumed that it was there, and they assumed they know what it is, right? And of course, they pay absolutely no attention to us or anthropologists, because they take it for granted that we know nothing that's worth a scientist listening to. I mean, we're a bunch of mystics and idealists, and we go around collecting photo all over the place. That's a harmless hobby that's got nothing to do with what we're doing, right? So we are dismissed. It's amazing, all that stuff that happened. The whole great project meant nothing to them. They don't even register it's there. And so they engage, of course, in reductionism, and you point that out. The whole issue is human nature, and the general proposition is the only question that really matters is what is the nature of human beings? What is it that's in our nature to be? So they go hunting around for that thing called human nature, right? And when you're doing that, what they brush aside everything else. They say, look, these are the things that are basically inherently human. And then all that religion stuff, that's just surface perturbation, right? It's just, cute little things on the side, right? It doesn't amount to anything much. The stuff you're talking about is superficial, right? That's what they say. That's the excuse for their reductionism, right? So everything we do is brushed aside, just like that. And that's the feature of reductionism. All human diversity is pointless, is unimportant, connected, compared to what is humanly universal, right? That's where we're stuck. We used to have a T-shirt around here some years ago that said on the back, same planet, different worlds. And that's the line we ought to stick to. That is to say, it is different worlds out there. Just because you're a scientist and you've lived your entire life in Cambridge, Massachusetts, doesn't mean you can say a damn thing about how everybody else's life looks. And our job is to show what those are like, and doing that is not very easy. You have to stick around for a long time, you have to learn local languages, you've got to catch all those diseases and all that sort of thing. It's hard work, right? And that has all been pushed aside because mere cultural variation is something on the surface, right? And we say, no, it isn't, right? It's something really deep and really important. If I make an analogy here with linguistics, as the evolutionary psychologists never attack linguistics. And why is that? It's because there are two things going on with language. The first thing is that it's a humanly universal aptitude. And it must be there because of the evolutionary process. That's self-evident, right? But on the other hand, people don't say the same things. And when you start looking at languages, they really work quite differently from one another. And you look at the tools, the incredible methodological tools that linguistics have, and they are substantial. That is to say, you can carry out the same piece of research by two different linguists and come up with the same result. This is powerfully impressive. It really looks like a scientific method. So they don't attack linguists, but we, cultural anthropologists, we're the soft target, right? And we've got to somehow get across that is not the case, right? There's also a special problem in America which I call superficial liberalism, which is every summer they have those culture things down in Washington, right, on the lawn in Washington there, and everybody's supposed to come along and have a little tent and all the rest of it, and there are napkins over here and whatever. And then what do they do on those things? They have folk cooking, right, and then they have folk dancing and folk costume, right. That is culture, right? And there is an underlying proposition which is a very good proposition. The proposition is everyone here is American. And that's the thing that matters, right? And it doesn't matter what your cultural origin is, you've got the same rights as absolutely everybody else. Which is what I was told on the 4th of July last up in Monticello. I am as American as anybody can possibly be. That means that people generally do think, that other people's culture is superficial. And if people behave in ways that they don't like or don't understand, their tendency is to pick them up and go, act normal, right? Just be a person. They think culture really isn't there, right? We've got a lot of work to do. Meanwhile, the findings of the great project have not been lost. They're still around there. They're still in all those books and all those field notes and so on. And it's a very messy bunch of stuff because it was done by such a bunch of diverse people who weren't in any kind of research organisation. There was no central tendency in the whole thing at all. But that is the result. And my own particular entree into this is what I call non-vulgar Durkheim, right? And the word that I hang on to is the word sacred, right? Which we bandy around a lot. To all intents and purposes, the only word you need from Durkheim. The rest of it is really quite boring to read. You do need collective representation, but that's a hell of a mouthful. The sacred is, there's a really cute thing about the sacred if you read the elementary forms of religious life, and that is that when Durkheim gets through comparing Aborigines and all the rest of it, he gets through and he says, religion is belief and action relative to sacred things, right? And you go, brilliant definition. Now, tell us what the hell the sacred is, right? And at that moment he says, sorry, can't. Durkheim's the great definer of everything, but when he gets to the word sacred, he says, I can't define it. It could be all kinds of things, right? And you go, my God, he gave up on essentialist definition at the right moment. Instead of saying, I know what religion is, which is what everybody else did, right, in the 9th century, what he said is, I don't know what the sacred is, but I'll show you a way to find it. The way he had to do with positive and negative rituals and all the rest of it. Effectively, he gave you a little ritual Geiger counter. You didn't put it do positive and negative rituals, but then it worked. And we tracked it all over the world, and we've got accounts of something that you might want to call religion. I mean, the word, I don't have to hang on to the word myself. I prefer to say understanding the world because I think it's much more than what normally gets thought of as religion. So we trucked around in the 9th century and we found all that stuff. And indeed it was incredibly diverse. Durkheim was right. Durkheim said, go out there and look for it. And 20th century anthropology did. And what did we report? The absolute diversity that we were expecting. We also discovered a whole bunch of other things, which is basically what we found out is sacred. If you want a simple translation of sacred, it means heavy. In the old hippie says, man, literally. It's heavy, just that way. And what that means is, when you go to different places, what heavy means is people take some things, in everywhere you go, there are some things that people take very seriously. And they're totally different to one another. And we don't need convincing that there's an American religion. I mean, its institutions are everywhere around us. And you know, some religions are all over the place, and you look at what religions are, and you think of the Bororo, Prescroppers Bororo, you know, I had to do it our and Borpe, and if you want me to tell you what they are, sorry, I can't. Looks that thick, don't we? What we found was that people's lives revolve around different things. And another way of saying that is if you ask people what is worth doing in life, what life is for, right, they refer to what to them is heavy, which is sacred. In other words, that is their religion. What you're talking about is what really matters in their world, and that is enormously diverse. We also discovered ethnoscience, great American achievement. What we discovered was that so-called primitive people knew an incredible amount about their natural environments, right? And that information, in the 19th century, they talked about everybody as if they went around in a haze of confusion, right? But they didn't. It was the anthropologists that were blind, not the Australian Aborigines, right? The archive built up in that way is basically the best evidence that has ever been produced or ever will be produced about the whole breadth of the human imagination. This, to those primitive people, unless we blow our world to pieces, which is entirely possible, there aren't going to be any tribes anymore, right? So that means if the tribes are gone, the record, the only record there was, is the record that all those scruffy 19th, 20th century anthropologists did in all their eccentricity. That record is absolutely irreplaceable and absolutely invaluable. And in decades and centuries to come, its value will grow, not diminish. The only problem we've had on the middle of this is that, of course, we have not conveyed our message well to everybody. So what we need is for people to write to an audience that is not a professional audience, right? That's where we ought to go. And that's, you know, I've been fiddling around with this, and I got to tell you, it's not easy. And what I found out of all this is that I found it very hard not to write as an academic. And I have a neighbour who writes non-fiction for young adults. And I gave her some of my stuff one time. She went through with a red thing and said, that's academic. That you go, oh my God, I can't get out of it. You're not surprising. I just spent, how many years is it? 38 years talking academic jargon, right? And we've got something to overcome here. Also, if you get in touch with commercial presses, what they say to you is, oh, professor, sorry. We're sure you know something, but we know you can't write. So here we all are, you know, my esteemed colleagues, Vic and Edie, Roy, Chris in the past, David, Fred, Susie, George, Ira, you know, we did our bit. There's a bunch of stuff out there that was written just by people in this department, and I'm very proud to be associated with that. That was a hell of a thing. And, you know, at this point, what I'm going to say to finish up is, I'm going to take a leaf out of Cassie's book, and I'm going to say to hell with George Marcus, my little daddy, my little kid.
Indirectly, Herb DeVore was his student.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I can't claim all lines of the section.
What Washburn and Saul Tax in the 50s were saying there's going to be more culture amongst animals and so forth, and more organic amongst human beings, and all sorts. And Tax, for instance, was questioning the use of the term primitive way before what you're talking about, so that there were people saying what you were been saying a long time ago.
I quite believe it.
Oh.
And there are certainly, as I say, other lines of dissent. I just haven't been attached.
Anyhow, get rid of that damn telescope.
Yes, I'll do my best.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Well, I have a question. You mentioned towards the end the importance of preserving elements of the great project. I will archive that. Speak up, please. Peter mentioned the importance of the great project and maintaining these archives for the future, and I'm curious to know what, if anything, you plan to do with your archive.
Stick it in a bloody library.
I was hoping for, oh, good, that's a good answer.
Yeah,
Last time I asked you that, I wasn't.
Lisa's been telling me about this. There are ways to get this on stories, which I'm quite innocent about, right? And yeah, I think that's right. And my field notes happen to be quite readable, and I wrote them in English. I've seen field notes that were impossible. But yes, it's got to be stored. And you know, one of the things we've always known is that no ethnography is the last word on anything. That's why we don't want to say social science. We go, look, I tell you what I know, and what I know is limited. And you may notice all kinds of holes in the thing. You know, then you can do lacunae, then you can do postmodern readings and so on. All that is available, right? And also, I might be slanting the facts, right? But this is what I got. That's the reason why then don't have to be readable, because you go, now I'm going to have to put the details in because I want this on record, right? And then people can get hold of that stuff. They reinterpret it, and they say, no, you know, your material is fascinating, but you've got to get it wrong. That's good.
Tell them where one copy of your book is, so to say, what they would classy.
Oh, yes.
Repeat the question, we can't hear back here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, we're talking about Bill Cassie again, my old friend Cassie, right? And Cassie was that woman who kept secrets, you remember, right? And there were lots of things she didn't want me to know about. So it was an arm wrestle. I mean, I had a big arm wrestling match with Cassie, and I used every dirty trick I could find to get around her, including finding people who didn't like her very much, sneaking around to blow the secrets and things like this. All very sneaky, actually, was, which is a piece of field work that we don't often report on, how you manipulate everybody to get stuff you want. It was very manipulative. But Cassie and I got on all right, and I think part of the reason for that was that Cassie was ambiguous about whether she wanted anything recorded or not. Because she did, in a way, she did want it recorded. And in a way, she didn't want it vulgarized. What appalled her was the notion that people would start doing rituals in a half-hearted way. And, you know, the rituals are supposed to be heavy, and the ancestors show up, and, you know, fooling around is not good. You've got to take them seriously. And she saw that the grandkids couldn't do this. The grandkids were embarrassed. They thought it was all old-fashioned stuff. They were embarrassed in a way. So she knew it was going down the tubes. But at the end, I did write a book about wrong death rituals. And in those days, I used to send everything I wrote, I would send to the Longhouse at Montreux, which burned down at the end of the 20th century. I mean, I would send more copies. But my book was in there. And when Bill Cassie died, she said that when she was put in her coffin, she wanted my book to go in her coffin with her. So she was buried. My book.
Buried.
She
buried.
You say
It's heavy.
That's heavy, right? It's not entirely unambiguous, because one of the things she's saying was that was my story. You pitched it. And I'm taking it back. Right? And I'm taking it to the land of the dead.
Well, maybe she was taking it to show the ancestors.
She was going to show it to the ancestors, but guess what? I got to be a slave because she possessed something on me. Right? So in my afterlife, it's either all those horrible anthropologists, or I'm going to get schlepped off to the horrible Longhouse and guy. Well, everybody will make fun of me indefinitely.
So, you mentioned David Flood. He's not here with us today, his in-laws are. And so I'm just going to go off here for a little bit. There's a few of us around. I think of David as being at the core of this, who like to think about ourselves, half jokingly, half seriously, as the Charlottesville School.
Good for you.
And maybe one day we'll be claiming you and others in this room as our ancestors. And I wonder,
Much good may it do you.
I wonder, what hope there might actually be for this great project. So the tribes are gone, and there's been a lot of questioning about whether they ever exist.
And that I don't mess with.
Yeah,
But I mean, I hope I said this plainly. Of course, cultural difference hasn't gone. I mean, the great,
Right.
I should have said that. The great project of the 21st century would have to do with how cultural variation appears within the global economy. And that is to say, it might be an old ethnicity retooled or some way, but it might be something completely new, cooked up out of the web or something like that, right? And that's going to be a bloody big project. I mean, that's going to be a heavier project than the Great Project. And it means, that is there work to do in the 21st century? There's much more work to do than ever, because cultural diversity is really going to be complex from here on out. And already it's noticeable that to do anything in the anthropology, social anthropology business, cultural anthropology business, you really have to know about economics, right? I mean, 20 years ago, you had to know about French philosophy. That was a war. And nowadays, you have to know about what's going on out there in the economy. And I think that's pretty fascinating. And, I think we've got a piece to put in that picture. There's a lot of naivety going on. We could prick a lot of bubbles in the world of neoliberalism, couldn't we? So,
right. I mean, it strikes me as interesting that, to steal some of your verbiage, people don't bloody like it. And so they find all of these different ways to manage it. That stuff, nobody else is looking at it but us. In the kind of open-ended way that you described. It seems to me like there's a way in which the old Great Project and the new Great Project have a lot to say to each other. Because some of the things they're doing are not all that different.
I do completely agree. I'm just too old and stupid to know what's going to happen next. So you have to figure that out. You guys. I got one foot in the grave, I'm going to cast. Anything else? Yes.
I fear that you may have been too cheerful and upbeat in your assessment of the sort of intellectual climate. Namely, just very quickly, namely the area of linguistics, it is worse than you think. There are some very actually surprisingly direct analogs to the kinds of things you're describing in the schools of linguistics. You have Chomsky with universal grammar.
Yes.
It has to be like that because it has to be a sort of contemptuous attitude for the second half of the 20th century towards documentation and attention to difference, which may or may not be shifting. Linguistics may be entering its great project now with language engagement and depth now becoming more visible as Chomsky sort of goes into his eclipse. But just so you don't act too upbeat about any of it.
Well, anything I know about that I've learned from you and Ellen. I take your point about Chomsky, but it still doesn't seem to me that he was sort of psychologically evolutionist. They're different crowds. Maybe there is a parallel.
It's extremely clear that everything that you said about the evolutionary psychology could be applied. I mean, the relationship, to these statements about what's universal and what's trivial,
Right.
What's worth pursuing and what's not, and also how important sort of seeking variation could possibly be. Right? That was absolutely parallel in what dominated linguistics for the period you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Oh, shocking.
No. Well, as I say, I wouldn't want you to go
Thank
home
you very
happy.
much. No, I'm sort of not back now. Because I thought you guys had everything sorted out.
Yeah, we do, it's just that no one's.
Yes. Terrible.
When we got started, we read Malinowski and Evans Pritchard, and then we did our thing. So, what should people do with your work? What should come from
You're tempting me to say something very stupid. I'm not rising for this. The books are there, what happens to them, how you have done like that. There's something called reader reception theory, right? I read the bloody books. I read them as, reader reception means that the reader should put in the creative bit, right? It was Roland Barthes who made this up. There were readly texts and writely texts, right? And then readly text were the more creative ones, right? Well, I didn't do that. I wrote a writely text, right? But that doesn't prove that everybody's going to, they're certainly not going to look at it, and even if they do look at it, they'll completely disagree. So, you throw it out, it's done. We all know this. You publish a book, and that's it. You've lost control. And that's the way it should be. Right? What's going to happen to your stuff?
I won't read it.
Well, there was a hell of a lot of ethnographers during the 20th century, and most of them completely forgotten. And just a few stand out. But what I want to emphasize is their cumulative effect, which is huge. And the big point about that is no one could get that stuff anymore. However incompetent we were, we're it. And that's permanent.
Are the Barrowan all Malays now?
Sorry?
Are the Barrowan all Malays now? I mean,
No. In Malaysia and Indonesia, if you call somebody a Malay, what you basically mean is they're Muslim.
Yeah.
Right, so the upriver people actually absolutely didn't become
But
Muslim.
they didn't sort of get absorbed in.
Yes, they went into Christianity.
Oh, they were Christian.
And if you ask them why they became Christians, they say, so I didn't have to be a Muslim. Right? I mean, that in-host interior antagonism is, centuries old, you know about that, right? But also, when I was there, it was very plain to me, they had become aware that they were in a tiny little corner of the world that was insignificant. They finally figured that out, right? So they wanted to join a global ecumene, as Padre says. And they're serious about this. They have international links with churches elsewhere. And that was definitely an attempt to sort of escape the narrowness of their own world. But of course, traditionally, as went down the tube, we're all inside that.
Following on that, I don't know if this is an optimistic question, but one thing about many parts of Southeast Asia and also Papua New Guinea and Melanesia is that people who jump in with both feet to the cash economy and all that, because the versions of it that go around there are not that attractive in the long run. They often check out as well when things happen, and people who appear to be living in completely uncontacted ways that the missionaries sort of trot out as uncontacted peoples. It turns out that 10 years ago they were sending their kids. Yeah,
yes,
and they're refugees. And so there is that sort of backward movement, right? It's not a sort of complete teleology.
Right. And I saw things like that in New Guinea as well. That people would step into the cash economy, make a bundle, and then revert to the traditional culture where they could be a big group because they had some money, right? That's not going to happen in Sarawak because the thing that was destroyed was longhouse residence. And longhouse religions don't make any sense outside of longhouse community. They're all about longhouse communities. And so, that's not going to happen. That's not going to come back. And last time I was there, I got cornered by young men from longhouses upriver who'd been sent down to the coast for schooling. And they'd got overseas for school. They're professional men, right? And they take me to lunch, the margarine, and we have a few cocktails, and they say to me, our cultures, what should we do to preserve it? Make a list of the things we need to hang on to. And you go, oh boy, am I ever going to be a disappointment to you? And what I say to them is, if you want to be uprooting people again, go and live in longhouses. Preferably in a nice junk somewhere. So I was a total failure of that business. Being what's work. And so far, nobody has said to me, we want to do rituals again, let's have your book so we can do a ritual. No one's doing that. But I've heard that happening in Australia. They say ethnographers who wrote stuff down get called back to explain. It happened to David Knight, you've never seen I know that. And he said, now I'm an elder of the tribe, and I'm the oldest elder of the tribe. And that's not happening.
I'm sitting here watching, listening to you and looking at the rotunda and thinking of Thomas Jefferson and his view of tribes and Native people, where basically he foretold that tribes would disappear if they were made more similar. And so I'm trying to see what you're saying is different from what Thomas Jefferson stated. And well, that's just the first part of my thought.
Right. Well, first to say, as I should have said, we talk cultural diversity will disappear, right? But what's happening in Sarawak is that people use, in the area where I work, there are really a hell of a lot of different languages spoken. In a particular little branch of the river I live in, there were 17 languages spoken here. Sometimes there were multiple languages spoken within one longhouse community, right? And what's happening is those languages are disappearing. Because people go down to the coast, the grandchildren are not learning those languages, they're learning Iban or Malay, and they just lose all their other languages. So they're dying flat out. Now, what's going to be culturally surviving that, I don't know. As for TJ, I know a little bit about TJ, but I don't know enough to answer this. He spotted something was bad was going to happen, right, I guess. But there was something he missed, is what you're saying, I think. That's true. I hope it's true in Sarawak.
Yeah, as a tribal member myself, I'm an enrolled citizen of the Indian Nation in South Dakota, Crow Creek Sioux.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
As a tribal member myself, an official federally recognized Indian, I have to assure you,
I'm an official
we haven't
federally recognized American.
We haven't disappeared. We haven't disappeared, though. And the tribes haven't disappeared. They persist against, Jefferson's predictions. And it may take on different forms, but we have on the mall, we have a museum, the National Museum of the American Indian. But I think what's missing is institutions like this. We don't have anything comparable. We don't have faculty, programs. I think this is a really great department. It's just too bad it's located here.
Get rid of that telescope!
Well, okay.
The tribe doesn't like it.
And should there be a department of Aboriginal studies on the grounds? Well, I'd be in favour of it. Really, I think everyone in this room will vote for that, right? And it needs some money to get it funded, and then we have to find people, who've got something, to contribute, who build a syllabus and something. This is not going to be easy. But your main point is I understand very well. I know peanuts about America, but I understand about the tribes not disappearing. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to go that way in Sarawak, right? And as for, all over the world, ethnic distinctiveness tends to get submerged in modernity. That's what everybody saw in 1910 when this whole thing began, right? And now, as I say, the opposite end of the thing is now nobody is not involved in the cash economy. When I went to the Sarawak, the people in my longhouse were not in a cash economy, right? And there was people having no money in their pockets, right? And they would say to you, I'm mischief, which means without money, right? But it didn't mean poor. And they weren't poor because they could feed themselves and they had their own society with high status people and low status. They had all the things that revolved around the longhouse, which in the 70s, really, that was the centre of life. I mean, after you lived there for a while, you forgot there was an outside. And by the time I got back in the mid-80s, all the young men were working in mining camps where they earned bugger all, and went on trees fell down, they got squashed and things like this. It's a dirty story. But they got used to money. And so when I went back in the mid-80s, there were these guys hanging around the longhouse, and they were out of work, but they wouldn't farm, right? And they would talk to the old people, and the old people would say, let me tell you the stories of the ancestors, and so on. They go, oh, no, I don't want to hear that, right? And it was the generation gap was really noticeable. I talk to little old people, and they say, we're nobody anymore. Nobody gives a damn about us, or who we know. Now, if that somehow turned around, gee. But the situation I see is gloomy. And every ethnographer's going to have to check in and explain their own case, right? I think. So, you again.
Yeah.
Well, because it's time anyway.
You're in charge.
Okay, I'll ask, because I sat here listening to the first part, and what you're recalling about Harvard Square in the 60s, and I couldn't help feeling a little jealous.
So you should.
Not because of the pot, you know.
Those were the days.
We've just had this huge financial crisis,
Yes.
and we can't seem to generate, for lots of complicated reasons, any kind of similar movement among young people. And I wonder, what you think about this place of higher education currently.
Now you're really throwing me an open-ended question.
We're all in a sense, like I like to say, when I have a couple of drinks, that basically we're being trained in a dying priesthood, and it's scary to us. Those of us who are
Scary, it was scary to me too. I mean, when I first took courses in anthropology, my parents said to me, why do you want to be an anthropologist? Our tribes are all gone now. And that was half a century ago. But the point about it is, you've got to tell them, hey, it's not about that anymore. I mean, you've got to make your own case, right? And which I'm sure you will do. And the fact that there's no shiver of left wing in America, I have no idea what the hell we're supposed to do about that. Fred and I have tried to explain to them how horrible it is. I'm not telling you. And I don't think they listen.
Let's go eat.
Second, the food will be there at 2:45. But there's plenty of, we'll bring out the wine. Sounds good.